So I'd like to start off today with a quote that kind of in this one slide encapsulates a lot of what I want to say in the message today. One of the great and grave threats or dangers to our soul is not always one huge disobedience. We were always afraid of that, one big embarrassing moment in our lives. But I want to suggest to you that perhaps more often than not, what is most dangerous to our souls is a series of micro rebellions that really on the surface may not even seem to be rebellious at all, that these represent the greater threat to our spiritual well-being. D.A. Carson agrees with this, but he comes at it from a slightly different angle. This is what he said. He said, people do not accidentally drift toward holiness. Now think about that. You don't just, well, look at that. Without even trying, I've become more like Jesus. He said people don't accidentally drift toward holiness. Apart from grace-driven effort, people do not gravitate towards godliness, prayer, obedience to Scripture, faith, and delight in the Lord. Now, I've highlighted grace-driven effort, and I think what Carson's saying here is what leads us to godliness and obedience to the Bible and praying is when we see Jesus in all of his beauty. We see what he's done for us on the cross. And we see his grace and mercy that forgives us. And when we feel it, then we move towards him in response. That's grace-driven effort. People don't accidentally just start becoming great prayer warriors. Usually there's an intentionality behind it, is his point. So where do we drift? How do we drift? He says, we drift toward compromise. And then we like to rename it to make it seem better, so we call it tolerance. Or we drift towards disobedience and call it freedom. Or we drift towards superstition and call it faith. Or we slouch towards prayerlessness and delude ourselves into thinking, well, I've escaped legalism. At least I'm not a legalist anymore. I never pray, but at least I'm not a legalist. Or we slide towards godlessness and convince ourselves we have been liberated. Now, when I found this quote, I found somebody assessing this quote, and they said this: Carson's quote vividly emphasizes that spiritual decline often happens not through one big dramatic moment of rebellion. What often leads to spiritual decline is just gradual neglect. And he goes on to say, it was gradual neglect that sometimes we misname. We misname our drift from God as something positive because I'm not a legalist anymore. Carson warns that without intentional grace-empowered effort, our spiritual trajectory tends downward. Several years ago, I heard somebody describe the Christian life, and I don't know what I really think about this completely. They said they compared the Christian life to walking up a down escalator. Now, a down escalator, if you're healthy, you can walk up it, go all the way to the top. But what happens if you stop on a down escalator? Do you stay where you are? No, if you stop doing anything, you go down. The Christian life is like walking up a down escalator. In other words, if we're not careful, if we just neglect spiritual disciplines and the things that help us grow, we'll many times drift from God. Now, let me give you a kind of a biblical example of this that comes from the Old Testament. If you look through the first 10 chapters of 1 Kings, you'll find a series of stories that describe, I guess, what you'd call the successes and the spiritual victories of the man named King Solomon. This impressive story in these first 10 chapters show him moving spiritually upward. Good things are happening to him. Let me just show you an outline of some of those. He develops this very special relationship with God. You could almost call Solomon a mystic. He has these two unique visions of God where he hears from God's voice, or he hears God's voice. And he's given as a gift deep spiritual insight. You could even call it the gift of wisdom. God gives Solomon great wisdom, spiritual wisdom, to rule the land, to help people with problems. And you also see in these first 10 chapters, several chapters devoted to the building of the temple, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, one of the most beautiful temples in all of Israel's history. Now, one more thing that we don't see in these 10 chapters, but is also true of Solomon, is that Solomon is such a significant character in the Bible that there are 3 books of the Bible that are attributed to him. Parts of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. So what I want you to see is that Solomon was a man of substance. He was a man with great wisdom. He was a man who became a builder for God. And then there's that critical 3-letter word that changes everything, the word but. He was all these things, but when you turn to chapter 11 in 1 Kings, his story begins to change. It's the pivotal point. In fact, let me just read to you some of the sad and tragic chapter from this sad and tragic chapter. It says, now King Solomon loved many foreign women. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, he married women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and from among the Hittites. Now look at verse 2. The Lord had clearly instructed the people of Israel, you must not marry from these different people. Why? Because they will turn your hearts to their gods. Yet, look at the rebellious spirit of Solomon. Solomon insisted on loving them anyway. And look at his capacity for love here. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. And then the condemning line that ends verse 3. And in fact, they did turn his heart away from the Lord. Now you come to verse 4 and it's looking back over the scope of his life in his old age, in Solomon's old age. In fact, they did turn his heart to worship these other gods instead of being completely faithful to the Lord his God, as David his father had been. Solomon worshiped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. And in this way, Solomon did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He refused to follow the Lord completely, as his father David had done. And on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, he even built pagan shrines. One for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab. Another for Moloch, the detestable god of the Amorites. This god would be a metal god. They would heat him up till the metal was white hot. Then people would sacrifice their babies on his arms. Well, Solomon built such shrines for all his foreign wives, for them to use for incense burning incense and sacrificing to their gods. So now let's take chapter 11 and kind of break down Solomon's drift from God. First of all, he married these pagan wives, and there a bunch of them, 700 wives, 300 concubines, 1,000 wives. He multiplied horses chariots, gold and silver, which in the book of Deuteronomy was condemned for these future kings. This should not be happening. He worshiped Yahweh at all the wrong places. He'd worship on the high places where these other gods were worshiped. He built pagan places of worship for his wives, and he too then began to worship these pagan gods and pulls away from Yahweh. What you see in Solomon is not something that took place overnight. You don't get 1,000 wives overnight. This took years, decades. Here we're seeing Solomon's drift from God. It's slow and gradual. It's so slow, it's almost imperceptible. Small steps, baby steps, micro compromises over time until he finally ends up so far from God, and he's not even sure how he gets there. Today, I'm talking to you about the danger of drifting spiritually. Sometimes it's seemingly, insignificant disobediences. Again, micro rebellions, micro compromises. It doesn't seem like it's that much, but over time, these built until this man found himself far, far from God. Mike Yaconelli tells a story kind of similar to this about a young couple who went to Hawaii for their 10th wedding anniversary. And one day when they were on the beach, one of the beaches of one of the Hawaiian islands, the woman got warm. She was hot. And so she wanted to get into the water to cool down a little bit. She really didn't want to swim. So she didn't take her flippers, but she took her mask and her snorkel so that she could lay face down in the water, snorkel up above the surface of the water, and she could just look at the beauty of the fish, the sea life that was in the sea. And she did that. But here's something that she didn't realize. Tragically, she got caught in a riptide that was pulling her out slowly enough that she didn't realize what was taking place until finally at one moment in time she lifts her head and looks and, oh my, look where I am. Now, let me read to you what she writes, or what is written about this incident by Yaconelli. He said, it didn't take her long to realize she was in trouble. Every swimming stroke that she made was just taking her farther away from the shore rather than closer to it. And so she swam even harder. She was not making headway, but she was losing ground. But because of her determination, and what Mike Yaconelli said about this woman is she was a very independently minded woman, strong-willed, a driven kind of person. She knew that she would not be defeated by this current. The force of her will would overcome this riptide. But here's the problem. Riptides and currents are not always easily convinced. And this is where she probably should have started hollering for help. But because of her pride, she just kept battling. You see, she believed that drowning couldn't happen to her. That's the kind of thing that happens to inexperienced swimmers, not people like her. She's a good swimmer. But she had never been completely and totally exhausted as she was that day, where her body had just essentially stopped functioning. And so in desperation now she frantically finally begins waving her arms and screaming for help. Even yelling, though, was difficult because she was so exhausted. Luckily, as she was perilously close to drowning, a lifeguard heard her weakening screams, and he made it to her just in time. She was so absolutely exhausted that she even lost control of her bowels. And when they dragged her onto shore, she could not move. It took an hour before she was finally able to even kind of partially sit up. And as Mike Yaconelli relates this story, as she had told it to him, she made this comment to him. She said, Mike, do you know how hard it is to ask for help? And that was part of her problem. She should have asked for help much sooner than what she did. But I tell you this story because her real problem was drifting. She became desperately in trouble with her drift. But because the drift was so gradual, it was imperceptible, you know. It was effortless. She didn't have to do anything to drift. Just do nothing. And she would begin to drift. And what was striking is that she was really enjoying looking at the fish. So her drift was effortless, enjoyable. In fact, her drift was so distractingly fun, she did not realize her danger until it was almost too late. And I tell you this story, again, as a metaphor for the Christian life. Sometimes we drift from God, not intentionally, not because we want to, not because we plan to, but we stop doing the things that keep us close to God. We stop praying. We stop reading the Bible. We start doing other things that we really, they may not be bad things, but they're not helpful things. They're not good things. And they're just part of confusing our lives. And a drift begins to occur. I mean, you talk to any alcoholic, and no alcoholic, when they first started drinking, thought, man, I can't wait till I become a drunken souse, sleeping in a gutter. They had no idea what would happen. These kinds of things just happen. And today I'm wanting you to feel the importance, the significance, the danger of drifting, spiritual drifting. And I've said all this now to take us to 2 John, which is the next to last sermon in this series on 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John that we're doing this summer at our church. 2 John is a simple book. It's the second shortest book in the Bible, only one chapter, 13 verses, 245 words. When I say it's the second shortest book in the Bible, the shortest book in the Bible is next week's topic, 3rd John. It has 219 words altogether. And what I found interesting when looking at 2 John in light of just having read 1 John and studied it pretty thoroughly is that there's a lot of similarities between the two. In fact, 70 to 80% of 2 John is actually in 1 John. Most of what you see in 2 John, we've already heard these topics in 1 John. For example, walking in the truth, loving one another, obeying God's commands. And then this one strong warning in verse 7 about deceivers and antichrist. That was one of the major reasons that probably 1 John was written, was to address these false prophets, these false teachers that were spreading things about Jesus that were not correct. Let's look at 2 John verse 7. John wrote these words, I say this because many deceivers have gone out into the world. They're all over the place. They deny that Jesus Christ came in a real, fleshly, human body. Such a person, John says, is a deceiver and an antichrist. And his warning here is all about the scourge, the plague of false teachers. Because what John wants us to see here is that many times when people drift, it starts with bad theology. It starts with incorrect ideas and notions about who Jesus was, or even what was important to Jesus. You see, what John knew was that in the 1st century AD is that these Christians were very vulnerable. They didn't have their own personal Bibles. They could be easily tricked and deceived. And John's heart goes out to them. I want to help you. I don't want you to get some wrong ideas about who Jesus is, because again, once you swallow some of this false teaching, it's the first step in the drift that's probably going to happen. So what John does next in these next two verses, it's kind of the focal point of the message today, is he starts to address the problem, the issue that could come of drifting away from Jesus and the true gospel. And so he starts off with watch yourselves. That's drifting lingo. Don't let yourself get in trouble. Watch yourselves so that you may not lose, that you may not drift away from what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. And he says, everyone who goes on ahead, or maybe moves beyond what the Bible teaches, what Jesus really wanted us to know about him. So anyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ, in fact, pretty strong statement here, that person does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. Now, this is in the English Standard Version. Just for clarity's sake, let me show you the New Living Translation of these same two verses. Watch out that you do not lose what we have worked so hard to achieve. Be diligent so that you receive your full reward. And look at verse 9. Anyone who wanders away from this teaching, going on ahead, believing things that are not true about Jesus, thinking that you're advanced because I know all this other stuff about Jesus. No, anyone who wanders away from this teaching has no relationship with God. But anyone who remains in the teaching of Christ has a relationship with both the Father and the Son. And this is what I want you to see. The language of these two verses is the language of drifting. John is saying to us, if you're going to be successful in your Christian life, you've got to be alert to what's going on. Watch out, Make sure you don't lose, that you don't drift away from what you have. Do not wander from this teaching. That's again, drifting lingo. Stay connected to Jesus. Don't lose your connection to him. Don't lose your relationship with him. Can you see that in this section? Because again, I believe this. One of the great and grave dangers to our soul, maybe the greatest threat to our soul, is not necessarily that I just mess up one big time. But I think for a lot of people where they experience a sluggishness in their spiritual lives is because they've gotten caught up in a series of micro rebellions and neglecting their relationship with God. And it's these micro rebellions that don't even seem like rebellions is what really get us in trouble. I like the way Eugene Peterson talks about this with this statement. He says, the Christian faith needs continuous maintenance. It's true. I think that's true. It requires attending to. If you leave a thing alone, you leave it to a torrent of change. Now look at this last sentence. If you leave a white post alone, it will eventually become a moldy, mildewed post. Just leave it out there in the weather, and eventually it will change colors. It will become dirty and grimy and moldy and mildewed. It's the power of a neglect that leads to a drift. It's slow, it's gradual, it's imperceptible, but it's real, and it's what happens to us. Well, let me close this morning with a parable that I found about 10 years ago that I think is really appropriate to today's message. It's called the parable of the skylark. And it's a parable that takes place in the Middle East, and this skylark was flying over a marketplace in the Middle East one day when he heard a merchant that he had never heard before. And the merchant was screaming out, "Worms! Worms for sale. Get your fat, juicy worms here. And of course, being a bird, the skylark was interested, and he flew down close enough to kind of see the merchant, and the merchant saw him. And the merchant said to him, "Oh, come on over and take a look at my worms. Fat worms, juicy worms, multicolored worms, worms that taste so good." And then he said this, "I'll give you 2 worms of your choice if you give me 1 feather." Well, the skylark was thinking, well, those worms do look good. And I've got all kinds of feathers. And so he looks at a spot where he doesn't think this feather is very necessary, pulls it out, gives it to the merchant, and the merchant says, "Pick the 2 worms that you want." And he does, and they were wonderful. Ecstasy. It was delicious. And so you would not be surprised to know that the next day, the skylark's flying around this same marketplace, and he hears the same merchant saying worms for sale, and he comes down again and gives up 1 feather for 2 more of the worms. Can you figure out how this story's going? Every day he does this. Every day he does this until one day he's become so fat from the worms and he has lost so many feathers that he cannot fly anymore. Let me show you the last paragraph. All at once, with a shock, he realized what had happened. From eating the delicious worms, he had grown fatter and fatter, and he had plucked his feathers one by one, first his body, then his tail, and finally his very wings had grown balder and balder. Horrified, he remembered how slowly, imperceptibly, day by day, it had been getting harder and harder to fly, and how he had told himself it was no matter. He could always stop before it was too late. And now, suddenly, here he was, trapped on the ground. He looked up. He saw the merchant looking at him. Was that a small, sly grin spreading across his face? And then look at this last sentence. And the merchant grabbed the now helpless bird and he put him in a cage and he walked away laughing. The merchant in the story is the devil himself. And this is how he likes to trap us, by giving away some of our life, thinking, well, this little part won't matter. Taking on things to where we're now not able to do what we were designed to do. In 2 John, the old apostle writes, watch out, be attentive to your soul, that you do not lose what we've worked so hard to achieve. Be diligent so that you can receive your full reward. Anyone who wanders away, drifts away from this teaching has no relationship with God. But anyone who remains in the teaching of Christ has a relationship with both the Father and the Son. Let's pray. Lord, I pray that you'll take this message today, very different from last Sunday's message, which was all about security and knowing how Jesus loves us. And now this message reminds us that you have given us opportunities and responsibilities to grow, to stay close to you, Lord. And I pray that if there's somebody listening to this today and they can see themselves in the story of the skylark, that they have drifted away and lost control and lost some of the life that they really could have and need and want. Lord, I pray that you'll pull us back. By your mercy, you'll forgive us and give us a new start. Help us today, I pray. In Jesus' name,